Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Hadfield. I'm the CEO of Message.io. I'd like to share with you a contrarian vision. It's a vision for a world where all bots work everywhere. That is, where every single bot works on every single messaging platform. Because we have this strange concept today of a Facebook bot, or a Slack app, or a Kik bot. And in fact, it doesn't make any more sense than a website that is optimized for Internet Explorer or optimized for Netscape. You see, the messaging clients today are just like the web browsers in 1995. The difference is that there's no W3C to enforce messaging standards. There's no concept of a universal hypertext markup messaging language. So in the next 15 minutes, I'd like to explain why I think it's inevitable that all bots will be cross-platform, and why everyone here in this room should aspire to make our bots work on all platforms. What we can do as a community to accelerate this trend towards a world where all bots work on all platforms. Because here's the problem. This is what the messaging ecosystem looks like today. It's a series of walled gardens. This is just a very small selection of the enterprise messaging or team chat platforms. If you're a Slack user, you can only text Slack users. You can only message Slack bots. Each one of these platforms has deliberately, for commercial reasons, which we can all empathize with, decided to box in their users, decided to box in their bots. You're forced to build bots using their proprietary APIs. Each have got their own slight variations in UI, but there's literally no concept today of interoperability between all platforms. If you want to reach the millions of users on Salesforce, the millions of users on HipChat, or Cisco Spark, or Skype for Business, you've got to rebuild your bot natively on those platforms, or use frameworks that unnecessarily constrain you in your capability. The same is also true in the consumer space. And so the analogy here is with SMS in the late 90s. Who here remembers that AT&T users could only text AT&T users? That Verizon users could only text Verizon users? And American Idol used to have one phone number on screen for AT&T users and one phone number on screen for Verizon users. Now that quickly changed, admittedly in that case because of regulatory pressure towards interoperability. But can you believe that today, even in 2016, you need to use your Facebook account to communicate with Domino's Pizza? If you're one of the 40% of American teenagers that uses Kik, you have to open the Facebook app in order to communicate with Domino's. There are no national or international regulators who are going to solve this. The platforms themselves have no incentive for common standards. The change towards this world needs to come from the bottom up, from all of us, not from the top down. But here's the good news. If you look back through human history, every communication technology that has survived has trended ultimately towards interoperability. Postal mail, the telephone, fax, email, the walls always come down eventually. It's going to change, and here's how it's going to change. This is what a unified messaging ecosystem looks like. In the past several months, very recently, the walled gardens have installed gates, the APIs. It's relatively new, and the consequences of this are only just beginning to sink in. My company, Message.io, is building the pipes or the plumbing that connects all of the messaging platforms into one unified network, enabling every bot in the world to be cross-platform. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But for now, I just want to establish this principle that we view each platform as nodes on a network, the unified messaging network. They're just browsers. In the future, to use another analogy, Facebook is AT&T, Slack is Verizon, And Domino's has one telephone number for consumers on any platform. But as we've built this company, we've uncovered one insight that I'd like to share with you. In the consumer space, as we all know, SMS is ubiquitous. In fact, Facebook is ubiquitous. Most Kik users have a Facebook account, and they use SMS. That's true also of Telegram, of Line, of Viber, and WeChat. They're all subsets of the overall Facebook and SMS community. If you're building for consumers today, I completely empathize for those that are choosing to build for only Messenger and SMS. You can reach more than 3 billion users this way without worrying about building for smaller platforms. But here's the insight. In the messaging, in the enterprise space, exactly the opposite is true. Most companies who use Slack don't also use HipChat. They don't also use Salesforce Chatter. So if you're building a Slack app and then you build a HipChat app, you can reach an entirely new user base that otherwise would not be able to use your service. In fact, there's very little overlap between all of the enterprise messaging platforms. And that means that anyone here building an enterprise bot for the enterprise market has to be cross-platform if you want to reach the maximum number of users. And so for the rest of this presentation, I want to focus on being cross-platform in the context of enterprise messaging, but just remember that the same logic also applies to consumer. So here's what's interesting. Who knew? There's more than 30 enterprise messaging platforms that now, because of recent developments, all have open APIs. They've all opened up their platforms to developers this summer after the runaway success of Amir and his team at Slack, which launched the app directory only 10 months ago. This is incredibly new. Hundreds of thousands of people around the world are using open source alternatives to Slack like Mattermost and Rocket Chat, just as one example. They're platforms that have an open API for inline bots. But let's just focus for a minute on the major players. If you're Slack today, you're worried about HipChat, you're worried about Atlassian, but you're also worried about Salesforce, a multi-billion-dollar company with 253 bots in the App Exchange. You're also worried about Cisco Spark, who's committed to invest $150 million in building out the enterprise bot ecosystem on their platform. You're worried about Microsoft, who's making huge investments in this space. Even RingCentral has purchased Glip, and they're reversing their telephony business into it because they've realized that if you're in the team collaboration space, you've got to put messaging, you've got to put third-party integrations at the core of your business. This is very important to at least 8 multi-billion-dollar businesses. And this is what they're worried about. This is the problem that I want to solve. This is what I call the bot gap. Because Slack basically has a complete monopoly on all enterprise bots. The third-party integrations that HipChat and FlowDoc and other platforms do have were basically built in-house. Everyone's struggling to emulate Slack's success. Everyone's struggling to attract developers to their platforms and ensure everyone's playing catch-up. This is why it matters, because enterprise messaging platforms are becoming the operating system for the enterprise, just as conversational interfaces are completely changing the way that we as consumers engage with the world around us, with every business, with every service, with every device. Similarly, conversational interfaces are becoming the primary way that employees within a company engage with all enterprise tools and all services. Messaging is the best way to engage with productivity tools, with developer tools, with communication tools. Messaging is the best way to engage with project management, with marketing, with customer support. If you're a customer service rep, who wants to go to zendesk.com when you can reply to customer service tickets in line from within the chat interface where you're spending most of your day? I'm not going to spend too much time on this except to say that every single one of the top 100 enterprise bots today is on Slack. It's literally a 100% monopoly, despite the fact that Slack has a fraction, a tiny, tiny fraction of the overall enterprise messaging space when you factor in what Microsoft and IBM and Cisco and Salesforce and others have in this space. If you've built one of these bots, and I know at least several people in the room have, then you need to be cross-platform if you want to reach the maximum number of users. And so just imagine being this guy stuck in the HipChat walled garden, or the Cisco guy, or in Skype for Business, because that's what your IT guy decided many years ago that the company had to use. Today, you can't access any of the tools that you want to use through messaging because all developers, every developer is building for Slack. So, having used at least 2/3 of my time on setting up the problem, now let me talk about how we're solving this at Message AI. We have a very simple mission. We want to help bot developers reach the maximum number of users. We also want to help messaging platforms who are not Slack reach the maximum number of developers. And so to do this, we've built a bot translation tool. We translate bots from one platform, such as Slack, to other platforms, such as HipChat or Skype. The same applies to translating Facebook Messenger bots to Kik or to Telegram, for example. No coding changes required. And I'd just like to walk through how it works. Right now, you might have a bot on Slack. Let's take StatsBot, for example. Today, a Slack user sends a message to StatsBot. It gets relayed through the Slack API to the StatsBot codebase, which might be on Heroku, for example. StatsBot replies back through the API to the Slack user. Easy, right? In order to translate StatsBot to other platforms, we ask the developer to update their endpoint so that the bot sends messages to and from us at Message.io. We, in turn, then generate an endpoint that can be used to create a bot on HipChat, an endpoint that can be used to create a bot on Skype. Now, when a Skype user sends a message to StatsBot, that message gets sent through the Skype API in Skype's format to Message.io. We receive that message in Skype's format and translate it into Slack's format and relay it to StatsBot. StatsBot thinks that message is coming from Slack, and so it responds just as it normally would to us. We receive that message in Slack's format, we translate it into Skype's format, and send it back to the Skype user. We're essentially providing a translation layer or a message relaying service such that StatsBot can now communicate with users on any platform despite the fact that it was built to communicate only in Slack's format. The consequence of this is that all bots, whether enterprise or consumer, can now be cross-platform by simply translating and relaying messages to other platforms. We map UI elements, for example, from one platform to another. It's not perfect, and it does require this belief that the UI interface across platforms is converging, not diverging. But just like we saw in the browser wars, we think that convergence to interoperability is inevitable. So I believe that we're heading towards a world where all bots are cross-platform, regardless of which platform they were originally built for or natively. I'll just end here by saying that I think fundamentally there's no such thing as a Facebook Messenger bot or a Slack bot app. They're all bots that can be distributed or deployed to any platform that has an open API. I call this bots that work everywhere, wherever your users are. Thank you very much. I have no idea if we have time for questions, but yes, we do. If anyone has any questions. Yes. I can repeat the question if you...
Yeah, hi, great presentation. I have two questions. The first one is this just kind of like a REST-based? Is it like a REST-based system, or does it work with Slack's, for instance, RTM versus their API?
Yeah, so the question was, is this just with the Slack's RESTful API or RTM support as well? So in fact, it's an any-to-any platform where you can translate from any messaging platform to any messaging platform. On Slack, for example, we have support for the Events API, for RTM, for webhooks, to answer the question directly. Every platform has their own protocol. Sometimes it's a different JSON schema, a different XML format. Sometimes it's plain text like Twilio. Every platform treats synchronous and asynchronous responses differently. And so, in fact, it's really not a question of UI variation. It's a question of the protocols that these platforms are inflicting, the proprietary protocols that they're inflicting on their developer base.
Cool, thanks. My other question is, so specifically with what we do, which is sort of like database integrations through Slack, we have a lot of questions around security. You know, people want some privacy, especially with their messages. Say they're uploading like credentials or talking about some secure things. Do you ever get concerns about, because it's one more relay that a message has to go, now it has to go to another third party, which is you and Slack and us, and then back to you, and then back to Slack, for instance, and then back to the client. Do you ever get questions around that, or how do you solve that problem?
Yeah, so I mean, clearly in building this, the question is about security and adding an extra relay step, basically where secure and private information is passing through an additional party. And so I just answer generally that what we aim to build here is equivalent to the telephony communication network, or the infrastructure that powers the world, right? And so each of these platforms is a node on the network. Each of the bots or conversational apps exists on this network, and data is flowing through the pipes and the plumbing. And so just like in the telecommunications space, huge issues around security and privacy and eavesdropping and everything else, we're now facing a similar challenge in the messaging world. There is no industry body that is coordinating this, as you have with the international telecommunications agencies. There is no national governments who are paying attention to this issue. Facebook and Slack, while participating admirably in these community groups, have no incentive to bring about this world. And so it's really about a group of us in the industry getting together and saying, yes, this is something we believe in. No more walled gardens. And there's a whole host of issues, including security and privacy, that need to be addressed as part of that.
How close are you to delivering this? In other words, can we buy it? And number two, if we go all in, what's your point of view of where we should manage, curate our content and our logic?
So the question is, how close to reality is this, and where do we create and manage our content in this world? On the first point, Message.io is live today. We currently support translation in the enterprise messaging space from Slack and HipChat and Skype for business, for example. We have essentially been in stealth mode. This is our first time we're talking about it publicly. In response to your second question, it's an incredible ecosystem that's built this summer of frameworks that enable you to, quote, deploy cross-platform, right? So from Howdy Studio and Automat, who I know are here, and Conversable and Converse and many others. And so we're not trying to provide an alternative to those tools. You should continue to use the frameworks or code directly in Node if you want to, using a proprietary API from one of the platforms. So we've designed this in such a way that it gives the developer maximum flexibility in terms of the choices of the tools and languages that you use to create your content. Once it's created, we can help provide a interface to platforms that speak in other protocols.
Hi. Thank you, first of all, for building something that's super useful. I've personally experienced this pain. My question is about binding identities across multiple platforms. Do you have any mechanisms for helping authenticate users coming from one platform and then tying that same identity to accounts that they have in another one?
So the question relates to identity and tying up identities from one platform to another. Just on the first part of your comment, which talks about the personal pain of this personal experience of this pain point, messaging is just the latest over the last 30 years of walled garden ecosystems that have trended towards interoperability, right? Most recently, perhaps, with social. This is a recurring theme every 5 years in tech, right? And so I recognize there's a long history, and messaging is not tackling this for the first time. So the question was about identity, and again, just like security, it raised this idea of a unified messaging ecosystem raises huge issues, right? Part of this vision is the concept of a universal identity that stays with you, the consumer, regardless of which platform you're on. In my most kind of zealous or ideological moments, you think about kind of not just bringing down the walls for bot developers, but bringing down the walls of the identity systems that each of these platforms have created and control and own, where you have one phone number that your friends can use. And so 2019 on the roadmap, in a very concrete way today, each user that engages with your bot on a different platform has their own identity profile identified with a unique ID that that platform uses. So we don't make any effort today in our current implementation to tie up your interactions with the StatSpot bot on Slack with the StatSpot bot on Skype. But in fact, if you're using Slack during the day to order a pizza from Domino's and then you get home in the evening where you don't use Slack, you're using Messenger, Domino's should still know it's you. And the only way that can happen is if there's only one Domino's bot that can recognize users across platform. And so that's definitely part of this vision of a unified messaging platform. Identity is a huge issue. Hey, thank you so much. Would love to talk, so please come find me.